introduction and for the opportunity to give this talk. Ljudevit Hanžek, you know me. I hope that this talk will be interesting and that I will say something provocative and worthy of discussion. So let me just say in brief how did it come to me holding this talk. I was working on some problems concerning the sense data theory of perception, and then Boran asked me would I be willing to give a talk here in as a part of this project. I said yes, and then he asked me a couple of questions about questions that I really didn't think about before. Namely, this will be the last part of this talk, in which I will try to relate the debate about sense data to our project and to problems of metaphilosophy. And after he asked me those questions, I actually realized that they are rather good and very interesting, and that what seemed to me to be a kind of a clear-cut case of philosophical methodology maybe is not so clear-cut, and that something very interesting can be said about the sense data inference or the way that people who argue for their existence come to that conclusion. So, what is sense data theory of perception? What are sense data at all? I believe that this is probably something which is familiar to all of you to some degree. Sense data theory of perception is the more or less classical theory of perception formulated in modern philosophy, both by authors working in the Cartesian tradition and the British empiricists. And the idea is that in sense perception, the direct objects of all perceptual experiences are not ordinary physical things in our environment, but that the direct objects of perception are, they call them ideas or impressions or images. The sense data is a 20th century term, but I will refer to them as sense data even when talking about Hume. That sense data are the direct objects of all perception. And what are sense data? Sense data are non-material entities. They are mind-dependent. They exist only while being perceived by a particular subject. They are private in the sense that they are usually thought of as particulars, and each particular sense data is cognitively accessible only to one subject during his perceiving. And very importantly, they are literal bearers of secondary qualities. Of course, the vast majority of these discussions concern visual perception and the secondary qualities of color. So sense data are thought to be colored. They are the things that can be red or yellow or blue or green or some other color. And let me just say this. What I will say here, all these arguments and objections concern primarily visual perception. But usually people who argue for sense data, they often hint that they believe the case could be generalized, and that other senses are probably work in the same way, and that just as there are visual sense data, that there are tactile sense data or acoustic sense data, and for every sensory modality. But the majority of the arguments are focused on visual perception. So just bear that in mind. So what is the main argument? Why would anyone think that ordinary physical objects cannot be direct objects of perception? but instead that we only directly perceive some mind-dependent mind-dependent and non-material entities. So the famous argument is it's called usually argument from illusion, or from perspectival variation, or from perceptual relativity. And the famous rendition is Hume's paragraph about the table, when he says that if you look at the table, you will see that it is of certain dimensions, of certain color, but as you move your head, or you tilt your head, or you walk a couple of feet forward or backward, that the table will change the shape, the dimensions, and color. And then he says, which proves that it is not in fact the physical table that we were perceiving, because the physical table did not change with these slight changes in our perspective. But it is clear that whatever it is that we directly perceived changed. So this means that the physical table is not the direct object of our perception. So this is the famous passage, and as an argument, it should go something like this: that the first premise is that the immediate or direct object of perception changes, which is evident, supposedly, but the physical object does not change. Why would we think that the physical object does not change? Well, because the best scientific theories about the physical world have it that physical objects do not change with only slight variations in the subject's perspective. And furthermore, imagine that there are two people watching this, looking at the same table, and one of them stands still and completely immobile, and the other person changes. The conclusion should be that if the table changes due to slight changes in subject's perspective, then that the table simultaneously both changes and doesn't change, which is absurd. So so it is very plausible to think that the physical table, the physical object, does not change in such a way, which means that the physical object is not the immediate object of perception, but some other thing, some other entity is what we directly immediately perceive. And this other entity, Hume calls it here image, but usually he says that those are impressions. Of course, the argument is not the argument is not very successful, because each of the premises can be challenged. For example, the first premise can be challenged in the way that why is Hume so sure that the immediate object of perception changes? Can it be that it appears to him that the immediate object changes, but it doesn't really change? Or the second premise was famously challenged by Thomas Reid, who said that in such slight variations of perspective, even the physical object changes in some respect. Namely, the physical object changes its relative properties. For example, the table doesn't change its dimensions if we measure only the ends of the table. But if we measure the angular size of the table, which is, if we imagine that there is an angle which goes from the subject's eye to the ends of the table, this angle will be of certain magnitude. But if we change our distance to the table, this angle will change. So this is the angular size of the table, namely some kind of relation of the table to the subject. And maybe what explains our experience, what explains the change in our experience, is the literal, objective change of relations that the physical object has to us as perceivers, and it is not necessary to introduce a mental entity to explain this discrepancy between perceived changes and actual change. So both of the premises can.
Whose answer is that?
Thomas Reid said that.
Okay.
That was his reply to Hume. As I often say, Thomas Reid had the misfortune to be Hume's contemporary, and thus cannot lay claim to be the greatest Scottish philosopher of his time. But he's actually a great philosopher with great arguments. So, but there are certain tacit premises included here, And in 20th century philosophy, people have made these explicit, and with the addition of those, the argument, in fact, does become valid. The first and the most important one is the phenomenal principle. The term phenomenal principle is from Howard Robinson's book, Perception, and it has that book was published in 1994, and since then the term has caught on in the literature, and now almost everyone uses this term for this idea, this premise. The idea is this: if it appears to me, if it perceptually appears to me that there is a certain object with a certain sensible quality, then in fact there is such an object with such a sensible quality. So if it appears to me that there is something that I perceive which is red, then literally it is true that there is something that I perceive which is red. The famous expression is from Price in 1934, I think, I'm not sure. When he says this passage about the tomato, he says, okay, when I see a tomato, there is much that I can doubt. I can doubt whether it is in fact red, or maybe it's green but under some other light. Maybe it's not a tomato at all. Maybe it's something cleverly painted or disguised. But what I cannot doubt is that there is something red that I see. He says even he says here, I can doubt whether there is any material thing there at all. Maybe there's no physical object. Maybe I'm hallucinating. But what I cannot doubt is that there is something red. So that's a very clear expression of the phenomenal principle, that if it appears to me that there is something red, then there is something red. That there exists something that is red and that which I perceive. And another important premise in this argument is the common factor principle. This is the idea that veridical perceptions, that is, perceptions which are true, which are not true, which are accurate, and illusions are usually understood as situations in which it appears to me that there is some object with some property, but that object doesn't have that property. For example, it appears to me that there is something red in front of me, but in fact there's something orange in front of me. That's an illusion. And hallucination is usually understood as when it appears to me that there is an object with certain property, but there's no such object at all. I'm completely the cause of my experience is not some physical object in my environment, which is also for illusions that holds. The cause is the physical object in my environment, but I perceive it wrongly. In hallucinations, there's no such physical object. So the idea is that veridical perceptions and illusions and hallucinations are all mental states of the same kind, of the same type, that there is a common factor in all these mental states, which is very important, because the idea is that if there is a common factor, then we can generalize from some, for example, if we discover an interesting fact about one of those types of mental states, we can generalize it to the other two. So, for example, if we discover that in hallucinations there can be no physical object as the direct object of our experience, by using common factor principle, we can generalize that that in all other perceptual situations there is no such physical object, because all perceptual situations share the same fundamental metaphysical structure. So that's very important, because otherwise there is no way to broaden this conclusion from cases of hallucination to cases of ordinary perception. And without this, it would be impossible to prove that even in veridical perceptions, what we immediately perceive are sense data and not physical objects. So a better argument. I formulated this argument, but I'm pretty sure that it is very similar to the way Ayer formulates it in his Foundations of Empirical Knowledge. It's very similar to his formulation. So let's say the first premise is the phenomenal principle. It says that if it perceptually appears to the subject that there is an object with a sensible property P, there is such an object. in hallucinations, it appears to the subject that there is an object with sensible property P. This is simply a phenomenological fact. Hallucinations are situations in which it appears to us that there is something such and such. From 1 and 2, we infer 3, that in hallucinations there exists an object which has the sensible property P, okay, because it's clear that it follows. But by definition, 4 says that in hallucinations no physical object of perception exists. That's the definition of hallucination. From that, it follows that the object of perception in hallucinations is non-material. It's not a physical object. The common factor principle is the premise 6, which says that hallucinations have the same metaphysical structure as illusions and veridical perceptions. And then from 5 and 6, it follows that in all perceptual experiences, the immediate object of perception is not a physical object, and that object, which is in fact the immediate object of perception, is called sense datum, or in plural, sense data. So this is, I would say, a pretty intuitive and it's a pretty simple and intuitive argument in favor of the idea that in all perceptual situations, what we immediately perceive, what we directly perceive, are actually sense data. But of course, it's the matter is much more complicated than that. Now I will go. This is the classical argument. I don't know why people usually call it the argument from illusion, because they always actually refer to hallucinations as the best case, as the strongest case for sense data, but somehow it's usually called argument from illusion. But there are other arguments also. I will now go through all the most interesting and the strongest arguments, and then we will see what's problematic about them and how can we challenge them or criticize them. Sense data was very popular. Sense data theory was very popular in the first half of the 20th century, or somewhere around the middle of the 20th century. And then it came under sharp criticism by the guy that wrote Speech Acts. Austin, yeah. Austin. He actually criticized the Ayer's formulation in the Foundations of Empirical Knowledge, and it was the criticism was very well received, and and it was very. It somehow changed the consensus in the philosophical community. There were some of the more contemporary defenses of sense data. There are those, for example, Frank Jackson and Howard Robinson, and there are other authors that also advocate even today sense data as the objects of perception. But let me just say one thing. When it comes to people who defend sense data today, or who defend sense data theory of perception today, there are some of them defend this more classical version of the theory, and I will talk about them. I will talk about Jackson's arguments and Robinson's arguments. There are other authors which use the term sense data and argue in favor of sense data, but they define sense data as they define them in a very different way from this classical option. So there's this idea about naturalized sense data, in which they say that sense data are actually parts of physical objects, surfaces, or something like that. And I won't be talking about those, because it seems to me that those theories are substantially different from this classical version of the theory. And in my opinion, this is my opinion, which can be completely wrong, they are not that interesting. And in contrast to their authors, I think that they're somehow the worst of both worlds, that they inherit the flaws of both sense data theory and the direct realism. Which they would disagree, of course, but this is my idea. So I will say something about Jackson's arguments and his views, and Robinson's arguments. Jackson, this book, Perception or Representative Theory, was published in 1977, and it is widely considered to be the best recent, or relatively recent defense of sense data. So he presents this argument from analysis, which is actually it's actually an awful argument to single out because it goes through 4 chapters in his book, and the argument is, in short, that if we take perceptual sentences such as I see something red, or it seems to me that there is something red, or this object looks red. So, for example, if we take these sees, seems, looks sentences and phrases, that the best analysis, the only analysis which can actually do justice to the phenomenology of such sentences, is a relational analysis in which we reduce all these cases of seeing, looking, seeming, or seeming to see. We reduce all these situations to standing in relation with a mental particular which bears a color property. So, but I mean, what is that actually? That's actually the phenomenal principle. Okay, so he says that it is clear that experiences have this act-object structure. That in all experiences we are actually related to an object, and that this object at least has the property of being colored. So he says the immediate object of all perceptions is a colored patch or a colored expanse. And then he generalizes this by focusing on cases of illusion and particularly hallucination to conclude that this colored patch or this expanse of color that we immediately perceive in all cases cannot be a physical object, because in hallucinations there is no such physical object, and hallucinations and veridical perceptions share the same fundamental metaphysical structure. So we conclude. So basically, he reverts to the arguments that I presented. But here the idea is that he says that even if we that the argument from illusion, the way it is usually stated, is not completely satisfactory, because the basic thing, the fundamental thing in that argument is to actually establish that the relational reading of these perceptual sentences is the correct one. And that is basically the phenomenal principle. That whenever it appears to me that there is something of a certain color, there in fact is something of a certain color. And a big part of his book, actually, and a big part of this argument is his debate with alternative theories, with alternative approaches to analysis of perceptual sentences, especially to adverbialism. And I will say something about it later. And finally, his argument is that prima facie, the only viable theories, the only viable proposals of analysis of perceptual sentences can be either sense data theory or the adverbial theory. But then he argues that adverbial theory is cannot be defended. So he concludes that sense data is the correct theory of perception. Okay. He presents a scientific argument also in the final part of his book, according to which color is not a scientific property. For him, a scientific property is the property that you can encounter, a property that science quantifies over. For example, if you read a physics book, you will not see that they use color as some kind of fundamental physical property, and that the properties that are mentioned in physical theories and which are sufficient from a physical standpoint to explain our experiences do not include color. But he says it's clear that there are colored things. So if there are colored things and color is not a scientific property, we have reason to believe that color is not the property of physical things. but it is clear that there are things which are colored, so these things are not physical things. These things are sense data. Okay, so
if I may interrupt,
yeah,
I saw a book once, and I'm sorry that I didn't buy it. The title of book is 100 Colors.
sure.
And that is a book, it comes from textile industry. It's for fashion and textile, for clothes.
Yeah.
And woman, Italian woman who works in fashion industry wrote a book about 100 colors. And it's a standard of colors for textile. And it is technology. And they do quantify our colors.
Yeah, but it's not physics.
It's technology.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
No. Okay, I'll think about it. I'll think about it later. Okay. I'll come back. His book also presents several arguments. One of these is the causal argument. The causal, if you have two mental states which have the same proximal cause, then they are the mental states of the same type and have the same metaphysical structure. But hallucinations and veridical perceptions have the same proximate cause. Proximal or proximate, I don't know which is the correct term. Basically, he says that if you take this causal chain that starts by a reflection of the light from the surface of the object, and then affects the eyes and the optical nerve, and then goes to the brain, and then some brain fibers start firing. The idea is that you could produce the identical experience, qualitatively identical experience, simply by replicating the last link of the causal chain, simply by directly stimulating these brain fibers that are firing, which means that veridical perceptions and hallucinations have the same proximate cause. They have the same neural cause. But if they have the same neural cause, then they are the same type of mental state. They have the same a metaphysical structure, and it wouldn't be plausible to conclude that in one case the object of perception is the physical object in the environment which started the causal chain, but in the other case the object of perception is a non-material thing. But we know that in the other case the object of perception has to be a non-material thing, because there is no physical thing in the environment which originated the causal chain. So since they have the same metaphysical structure, then in veridical perceptions also the direct object is the sense datum, a non-material thing. He has also he presents the time lag argument, and this is very interesting idea. Basically, he says that the object of perception, and this is specific, and he says this is specific for perception, for perceptual experience. This does not hold for other cognitive mechanisms. The object of perception has to exist simultaneously in the same time with the act of perception. So it cannot be the case that I can have an experience in time t0, but that the object of experience does not exist at t0. But if physical objects are objects of experience, then we cannot exclude that possibility, because the object could be destroyed or significantly changed during the time that the light travels from the object to the subject's eye. So if physical objects are objects of perception, they could invalidate one, which means that they cannot be objects of perception. So objects of perception have to be things that are always simultaneous with the act of perception, and the best candidates for that are sense data, mental entities or mind-dependent entities, which are private to the subject's consciousness, and he says that they are an integral part of the experience. They constitute the subject's experience. That's the time lag argument. Now let me see. Okay, what can we say? So these are the most familiar arguments, and there are also some very familiar problems for sense data theory. The first thing that we can list are the flaws of the arguments for sense data. I will go back now to the arguments and that we try to see what. Just a second. No. Okay, here. Okay. So if we take this as an example of an argument, it's clear that if somebody denies either 1 or 6, that the conclusion does not follow. Okay. So based on first principle or the common factor principle or both. And there are actually there are various theories, various alternative approaches that deny at least one of those. So, but I will come to that. Later. I will discuss in somewhat more detail how the denial of these principles go. The argument from analysis basically boils down to the same thing. That since the argument from analysis is, as I believe, simply a more elaborate expression of the phenomenal principle, denying the phenomenal principle would, in the same way, be the rejection of this argument. Scientific argument. This argument could be challenged in various ways. One of which is what Boran said, and the idea to actually claim that physical objects do have color, that physical objects are colored. But the thing that we should bear in mind with this argument is that Jackson advocates several claims about colors. The first of which is that color is the literal property of the objects of our experience. So what it is that has color, the objects of our experience, things that we perceive, they have color, they are colored. But also, color is there is no differentiation between color as the property of objects and the sensible quality that we somehow enjoy while perceiving colored objects. So the quality, or as we would say, the phenomenal quality of color is basically color. There is no color as distinct from the subjective quality of experiencing color. And then, since he claims that objects of our experience are literally colored, and colors are subjective, are the same thing as subjective qualities that we are somehow acquainted with while perceiving colored objects, then if physical objects were colored, it would mean that they have to possess or somehow have these phenomenal properties, and this is problematic from for various reasons. And the basic one is that there seems to be an explanatory gap between the physical descriptions on one side, the physical descriptions of objects which are phrased in terms of structure and function and dynamics, and are basically phrased in language of mathematics. And on the other hand, this sort of intrinsic, what Harman calls intrinsic quality of experience. This is basically what Joseph Levine calls the explanatory gap, that it seems that the structure and function and dynamics that we found in physics can never actually adequately and sufficiently explain why, when we perceive an object that satisfies such a description, why do we experience precisely these qualities and not some other? Or basically, that's the inverted spectrum, okay? So there's this idea that there is a gap between qualities of color and physical descriptions of objects. So, and if physical objects were colored, it would mean that they would be that we would somehow have to attribute these intrinsic qualities, these phenomenal qualities, to them as if they bear them. And he says simply, when you read physics books, you never find that. You find that all the fundamental descriptions which are actually used in equations, which are used to predict experiences, are always phrased in terms of mathematics and structure. So that would probably be his response to this Boran's claim that physical objects can have color. Now, Boran said that there are branches of science which actually do quantify over color, and which use colors as somehow use them to categorize items. I guess that Jackson would simply say, I mean, the somehow response that comes to mind is that sure, there can be such uses of color in some derived scientific disciplines. But in basic physics, he would probably claim that when it comes to basic physics, to fundamental physics, there you will not find colors as part of the vocabulary. And then would probably say that scientific property is that which occurs in basic physics or in fundamental physical theories, and color is not one of those. But what I had in mind, what I find somewhat problematic with this argument of his, is this idea that he equates this quality of color, which is obviously somehow present in our minds, in our consciousness while we perceive, with the property of color. So, of course, I'm close to the adverbial interpretation. We'll come to that shortly. That maybe these qualities, which are present while we perceive colored objects, maybe these qualities are not uh, 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 literal properties of object. Maybe these qualities are simply modifications of our mental state, which are caused by some physical property in the objects, such as some kind of physical disposition to cause certain types of experiences in us. So basically, I would criticize this argument in this way of trying to somehow trying to find the difference between the qualities of experienced colors, qualities of experience in color perception, and colors as properties of physical objects, which I would somehow say that colors are dispositions of physical objects to cause certain qualities in our experience. Okay, the causal argument. The causal argument can be resisted simply by denying premise 2. Okay, and premise 2 is in some way expression of the common factor principle. So simply deny the common factor principle and deny that you have to give the same account, that you have to give the same metaphysical analysis of experiences if they have the same neural cause. And then the argument does not move forward. And this is what naive realists do, disjunctivists, for example, when they say that even though hallucinations have the same neural cause and share a great deal of neural mechanisms, simply put, the veridical perceptions are constituted by the physical object in the environment which started the causal chain, and this is what differentiates them from hallucinations and actually makes them experiences of a completely different type. So basically deny the common factor principle. The time lag argument, I have to admit that I do feel some pull towards this, and that the premise one, for example, the premise one does. I mean, the obvious strategy here is to deny premise one, and deny that perception is in this way distinct from other cognitive acts, and say that just as I can remember something which doesn't exist right now, or just as I can think about something which doesn't exist right now, or anticipate something which doesn't exist, in a similar way, I can perceive. I can literally perceive or experience something which doesn't exist right now. For example, if the sun explodes during the time that the light traveled from it to my eyes, in the moment when I see the sun and haven't seen the explosion yet, the literal object of my experience is the sun, even though the sun doesn't exist anymore. Sorry, let me have a sip of water. Now, I guess I have to admit that I haven't thought very extensively about this, but this is the only way to resist this argument. I mean, you cannot deny premise two. Okay, you cannot deny premise two because you can have situations in which physical objects stop existing during the time that light traveled from them to the subject. So to deny the argument, you have to deny the first premise. The second problem that I listed here is the metaphysical awkwardness of sense data. So sense data are supposed to be non-material and private and literal bearers of color. The interesting question here is, do they have literal dimensions and literal shape? Most of the authors agree that they do, that they have two properties basically, that is color and shape, and dimensions are included in shape. Okay, maybe. And then you have to ask if they have a shape. That means that they are somehow spatial. They are in space, but in what space? They cannot be in physical space. So you have to either claim that they are in physical space, even though they are not physical objects, or you have to claim that they are in some non-physical space, that they are in some kind of subjective space, which is doubly problematic, because now, apart from non-physical objects, you have to have a non-physical space, and it simply seems problematic to postulate something like that. Closely related to this metaphysical awkwardness of sense data are the determinacy problems for sense data, which I think is a really strong argument against them. So the famous example is that of a speckled hen. So imagine that you see a hen, a chicken, okay, which has a number of speckles or spots on it, and then you see this chicken which has a number of spots. But which number? How many? You don't know. It's not. It doesn't appear to you that there is a determinate number of these spots. It's somewhere between, I don't know, 30 or 50. But you haven't counted them. When you saw the chicken, you didn't stop and count the spots. So what it actually appears to you? It appears to you that there is an object with an indeterminate number of spots. But how can something exist with an indeterminate number of spots? The number of spots has to be determinate. It cannot be that in reality the chicken has an indeterminate number of spots. But according to phenomenal principle, it would if you perceive a sense data which has an indeterminate number of spots, according to phenomenal principle, then that sense data would literally have to have an indeterminate number of spots. But it seems very problematic, metaphysically very problematic, to claim that something indeterminate exists in reality. So many authors conclude from this that the phenomenal principle cannot be true. Otherwise, it would lead to indeterminate objects. And if phenomenal principle is not true, then the whole case for sense data collapses, because the phenomenal principle is the heart of the sense data theory. And number 4 is the plausibility of alternative accounts. So sense data theory is not the only game in town which aims to explain how can illusions and hallucinations be subjectively indistinguishable from vertical perceptions, but be metaphysically have a metaphysically different structure. And insofar as these alternative theories are plausible and can be defended, then there is no need. There is no need for sense data theory. Okay, I will come to these alternative accounts. I will mention them in brief, but let me now focus on what I said before: the denial of the phenomenal principle. So when I first read Robinson's book, that was some time ago, I remember how my intuitions about the phenomenal principle shifted radically multiple times during the reading of the book. In the first instance, when I saw the formulation of the phenomenal principle, it seemed very obvious and clear to me. It seemed a necessary truth. But then, as I started thinking about it, I actually had a change of heart. Then I had a time when I was completely unconvinced by it. And what I think is somewhat problematic is this: when he says, okay, these philosophers that he mentions that are in a broadly Cartesian tradition, those are the empiricists, okay? And he says they all must have accepted the phenomenal principle. This is that the principle is very closely associated with the belief in the self-intimating nature of consciousness. And he says all these philosophers believed that there could be no certainty greater than that given by something's being clear and distinct to consciousness. So this is basically, we come back to Descartes. If I conceive of something clearly and distinctly, then it has to be true. But to me, this seems problematic if we apply it to things that exist in the world, to things that exist contingently in the world. As Hume says, the only way to establish matters of fact, or that something exists, is to perceive it, and these perceptions can always be wrong. They can always be mistaken. But in affirming phenomenal principle, even Hume agrees with this. And to me, it seems that this simply is, how to put it? I'm not convinced that this is a warranted move. That if it's no matter how clearly and distinctly it seems to me that there exists something such and such, I'm not sure that gives me justification to to accept that there exists something such and such. It is different with, for example, it is different with modalities. If it seems to me clearly and distinctly that this has to be the case, otherwise absurdity would follow, or if it seems to me that this has to be related to this, otherwise there would be a contradiction, I think that has much greater chances of success and of resulting in a justified belief than the situation in which it seems to me that something exists, but I'm fully aware that this existence is not necessary. Because when it seems to me that there's something red in front of me, this is a contingent fact that there is something red. There could have been something green, or there could have been nothing at all. So when we remove, I believe that when we remove this aspect of necessity, this aspect of modality, that this actually breaks down, and that consciousness is not self-intimating in that situation. Crane has an interesting idea. He says that he, sorry, what did happen? Did I click something? No. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
No,
So Crane says that basically, Crane says that there are two conceptions of sense data. That there's this less demanding and this more demanding. This less demanding conception of sense data is simply the idea that in perceptual experiences, I am aware of something. That there is something that I'm aware of. There is something that I'm conscious of. That my mind is not a blank slate. I'm not sleeping. I'm not being unconscious. There is something that can be described as the object of my consciousness. And this more demanding conception is the idea that sense data are non-material private entities which the subject is infallible in perceiving. This is the more demanding conception of sense data. And he says when people say that it is introspectively clear to them that there are sense data, he says they actually think of this less demanding sense, in the sense that it's clear to them that there's something in their consciousness, something is given to their consciousness. But and this seems obvious, he says, when I think about something, when I perceive something, when it seems to me perceptually that something is the case, something is given to my consciousness. There is an object of my consciousness. But the sense data in this more demanding sense would be this enriched theory in which we start to draw inferences about the nature of sense data. And he says this jump from the less demanding to the more demanding aspect is not warranted. What is interesting to me here is that I think that Crane has a good point, and I think that a lot of this is something I don't have this really worked out, but the idea is that there could be an ambiguity in this phrase being aware of something. So and actually I wonder if the disagreement comes from people reading this phrase in two different meanings. So maybe someone reads it in, if I'm aware of something, then that thing which I'm aware of has to exist. Or somebody else says, no, I can be aware of something which doesn't exist. I can be aware of Zeus or Pegasus or the Fountain of Youth. It is true to say that I'm aware of those things, but it doesn't mean that they exist. But to someone else, it can seem that, okay, if I'm aware of something, and it's clear that I'm aware of something when I perceive, that something has to exist. Otherwise, I'm not aware of anything. But it's clear that I'm aware of something, so that has to exist. So my idea here is that maybe the confusion and the controversy comes from people reading this aware of in different senses. Some read them as it has existential import, and some read it as it doesn't. But this is something that I would have to work out in more detail. Okay, so let's just briefly go through these alternative theories, and then I will have a metaphilosophical comment. The most famous alternative theory, which was actually there were very famous debates between adverbialists and sense data theorists in the second half of 20th century. Adverbialism says that it is not necessary to read perceptual sentences in a relational way. What is necessary is to read them as saying something about my experience. When I say that I see something red, the idea is that this red is not a literal property of the object of experience. This red is a modification of my experience. It is the way I experience things. I sense red, literally, When I see a red round object, what happens is that I see redly and roundly, or I visually sense redly and roundly. So the descriptions of the object of experience are basically descriptions of the way that the subject senses the modifications of the act of experience. Now, the most famous problem is actually was formulated by Jackson for adverbialism. This is the many property problem, which he says that the adverbial semantics is not expressive enough to capture some very clear distinctions between perceptual situations. For example, when adverbialist says that he senses redly, squarely, greenly, and triangularly, does he mean that he senses a red square and a green triangle, or that he senses a green square and a red triangle? Now, of course, this seems somewhat a cheap argument, because it's clear that the adverbialists would have to include some kind of hierarchy of predicates, or some kind of ordering of predicates, in order to differentiate between these two situations. And adverbialists really do that. But then the debate, then Jackson has an argument against those devices that they introduce. In my opinion, and this debate very quickly becomes extremely technical, and nitpicky. But you can. I will simply say that, in my opinion, this is not an insurmountable problem, and that people like Michael Tai, for example, in his papers during the 1980s, and his book, the 10 Problems of Consciousness in the 90s, I think that he gave some very good responses to this problem, and showed in enough detail how adverbialists can handle these situations. Intentionalists are authors who claim that the essence of perceptual experience is the fact that perception represents the world to be in a certain way. There is a propositional content in perceptual experience. There is literally a proposition which describes the way the subject sees the world. And this is what is in common between veridical perceptions and hallucinations. And there is no need, the experience is not necessarily relational. We can have experiences which have no objects, but all experiences have a representational content which can be satisfied or unsatisfied. And illusions, hallucinations, and perceptions are indiscriminable, because they can have the same content. This is what explains why the subject cannot differentiate between those, but those have different metaphysical structure. Basically, they accept, just like the adverbialists, they accept the common factor principle, but they deny the phenomenal principle. And finally, the naive realism is an interesting theory. They accept a restricted version of the phenomenal principle, saying that in veridical perceptions, the physical object is the literal constituent of my experience. My experience literally metaphysically constituted by my relation to this physical object, and this relation is primitive. It cannot be physically explained. It cannot be reduced to physical mechanisms. But they deny the common factor principle. They say that there is no reason to think that if two experiences are qualitatively identical, they have to have the same metaphysical structure. They say, no, simply they are qualitatively identical. They are such that the subject cannot differentiate between them, but it doesn't mean that they have to be metaphysically the same. They have the radically different metaphysical structure, but they can appear the same to the subject. Now, of course, as you may sense, no pun intended, the main problem there would be to explain why these experiences are indiscriminable, even if they have a radically different metaphysical structure. But that's a very detailed debate, and I can't go into that now. And I will conclude. This is the final slide, with the question that Boran asked me the other day, and this is that is sense data a scientific theory? Is sense data theory a scientific theory, or is it more philosophical? Which this is what I said to him. So, what could be some reasons to think that sense data is similar to scientific theories, that it is scientific in nature? So one idea, one argument could be, and this is something that seems very intuitive to me, that in sense data sense data theories, they literally hypothesize the existence of an entity to explain certain phenomena. What needs explaining? Our experiences. That's the evidence. That's the phenomena that we are trying to explain. And specifically, what are we trying to explain? We are trying to explain how it is that it appears to us that there is something red or there is something blue, even though there can be, even though we can be in a situation where there is no physical object that is red or blue, and how it is that we can have the qualitatively identical experiences in situations which are radically different in terms of their veridical status. And then the idea is, okay, but there's this entity which is present in both cases, and this entity is something, and our relation to this entity, this sense datum, is what explains why we have identical experiences in both cases. And in this vein, sense data would be like electrons or viruses, as Boran said, some entities which are not immediately obvious or evident to us, but which are needed to explain certain phenomena of our conscious lives. And interestingly, Jackson, in his book, claims that sense data theory is only contingently true, and that while it is the case that physical objects are never objects of direct objects of perception, that it could have been the case that they are, but as it turns out, they aren't. And sense data are the direct objects of perception. And this idea that sense data theory is only contingently true, coupled with this obvious explanatory role that they play in trying to explain our experience, I think gives support to this idea that the sense data inference is basically an inference to best explanation, that sense data are entities that we postulate in order to explain certain properties of our experience. As a different view, as an opposition to that, and the view to which I'm closer, though I wouldn't say that I'm very convinced in this, but I would say that I'm closer to this idea that sense data is a distinctively philosophical theory. I would say that there are several things that work in that direction, namely that the sense data theory is very general, and that it is not put forward, sense data are not put forward as entities that explain a certain type of mental states, a certain type of cognitive act, but they are thought to be an explanation of any kind of experience, any kind of perceptual experience. And in this sense, I would say that though this may be a difference of degree, I don't have a problem with that, but this generality, this universality, that they are thought to be an integral part of any kind of perceptual experience, I think that this would somehow push the theory more in a philosophical avenue. The second idea is that the central parts of the sense data theory are these two conceptual claims: the phenomenal principle and the common factor principle. I've already talked about the phenomenal principle, but the common factor principle says that basically says that if two experiences are qualitatively identical, then they have to have the same metaphysical structure. So this is literally a conceptual truth. It is treated by its proponents as a conceptual truth about correct classification, about correct classification of mental states, and what are their essential properties. Now, this to me To me, this sounds very philosophical, and it seems like more of a thing that you would encounter in philosophical debates and discussions than in science. Just a second. The third idea is that while it is true that in sense data arguments people infer the existence of an entity, and thus by Hume's account, it would push the theory in this empirical way, in this scientific category. The existence of sense data is inferred from these necessary truths, like phenomenal principle and common factor principle. And I don't think there's anything problematic in saying that philosophical arguments can have existential conclusions if some of the premises are conceptual or necessary truths. Basically, we have to have to have a philosophical argument which ends in an existential conclusion. In my very traditional view, you would have to have a premise, at least one premise that is very strongly conceptual or a necessary truth or definition, like, for example, the phenomenal principle or common factor principle. And then you would have to have a premise which states some matter of fact, which is contingent, like, for example, there exists experiences exist. Because you could have you could say that the phenomenal principle is true, but there are no sense data because there are no experiences at all. But since it is obvious, it's a contingent truth, but seems obvious that there are experiences, and if we advocate this necessary, we treat it as necessary truth, the idea that if there are experiences, that then the content of experiences has to be true, then I don't think it's problematic how a philosophical theory can have an existential conclusion. It doesn't seem to me to be very problematic. And finally, it is my understanding, though I wouldn't argue very strongly for this, but that in inferences to best explanation in science, the relationship between evidence and the entity that is postulated to explain the evidence is usually causal, or that there has to be some kind of causal relationship between viruses and symptoms, or electrons and trails in the cloud chamber, or stuff like that. But here, the relationship between evidence, which is our experiences, and these hypothesized entities, sense data, is not actually causal. It is not that sense data cause experiences. Sense data constitute experiences. What it means to have an experience is to be related to a sense data. It is not the fact that that I am acquainted with the sense data is not distinct from the fact that I have an experience as of something read. Literally, it's either the same fact, or this fact about my acquaintance with the sense datum is constitutive. It constitutes the fact that I have such and such experience. So it seems to me that in this case, the relationship between these the phenomena that we try to explain and the entities that we invoke to explain them is different than it is usually the case in scientific arguments or in inferences to best explanation. And with that, I would now conclude, and I would ask you to please come forward with your questions and particularly objections. So I hope this was interesting and substantial enough that you have something to object to.
Maybe, Ljudevit, maybe it would be better that you chair yourself, because my link is
okay. Okay, I can chair the. I didn't see who raised their hand first. Sorry, I was looking at the presentation. Okay, Mr. Balaguer, Mark.
Or maybe Mark.
I think it was Mark Balaguer. Yeah, okay.
What does it matter who went first? I'll go first.
Okay.
So I think I'm in pretty much agreement with like the main threads of what you were saying against the sense data theory. I wanted to say a couple of things. One was like the hand-wringing about the phenomenal principle, like the phenomenal principle seems to me to just be transparently incompatible with physicalism. And so any physicalist would just be like, that's false. It implies that there are weird immaterial things in my head, and there aren't, so it's false. So that's one thing. The second thing is about Jackson's argument. And it seems like there's a response that you can make, which is Jackson's assuming that the semantics lines up with the way the world is. And the person who doesn't believe in sense data can just deny that. They can go, oh, Jackson's got the right analysis of those sentences. Guess what? The sentences aren't literally true, but it's still a useful way to communicate. So it might be that the right semantics of talk of hallucinations commits you to the existence of these weird immaterial things. That doesn't mean they exist. That's just how the folk talk. And so you could have a non-sense data theory of reality and a sense data theory of the semantics and just say the sentences aren't strictly true. And I think when you start thinking that way, it also gives you a different response to the time argument. So like,
oh, yeah.
Right? Because you're like, oh, maybe an object needs to exist at the same time as a perception. Maybe that's a true claim, but then it just turns out that when I'm seeing the sun 2 minutes after it blew up, I'm not actually seeing anything. And that's just a question about the semantics. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah. This is great, actually.
I mean, these are just friendly suggestions, right? I'm not disagreeing with anything you say.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't thought about it from this perspective, but yeah, I mean, obviously Jackson disagrees, and he thinks that these sentences are literally true. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, but the whole argument, his whole argument is about the analysis of what's the right understanding, and so the whole argument is right, and then just at the end of the day, you're just like, yeah, they're not true, and he hasn't argued for that.
I mean, I guess no, but actually, there's a passage in the beginning of his book. So this was so the book was published in 1977, and he says in the first chapter, he says that some people will object that I use this traditional philosophical methodology of analysis of linguistic and conceptual analysis of entailments. I consider counterfactual scenarios and stuff like that. And he says that basically he's referring to Quine's ideas and to Quinian thoughts. And he says that that's fine because he says that they are simply wrong. And this modern approaches of degrees of peripherability or closeness to the periphery, to theoretical closeness to experience or something like that. He says they are simply there's nothing among these suggestions which can replace these traditional philosophical notions. And then he says, I use this analysis not to demonstrate something about the language in which we speak about sense data, about perception. I use it as a way of actually finding out the truth about reality. So his idea is that the correct analysis has to be true, because that's what defines the correct analysis, that it is true, that it correctly describes reality. So this is basically his philosophical commitment, that he would simply say, okay, if the analysis is correct, then the sentences have to be true. So he would deny your approach, but I think and I really think I really would like to thank you, and I think that this what you said, that this can help with the time lag argument. I'll have to think more carefully about it, but I really like that suggestion. So thank you very much. Okay, I think that Justin Weinberg was next, if I believe.
Thanks. I think my question's similar in thrust to Mark's, but it's probably a little bit worse, just because I'm not as informed about, I haven't thought about this stuff in a while, let's put it that way. But When I see something, look, what I'm seeing is light, right? Photons are hitting my eyes. Sure, we talk about seeing the sun, but I'm not seeing the sun. I'm seeing light, right? Or even seeing light might be a weird way to put it. Just like photons are hitting my eyes, okay? So if that's what's really going on with sight, that takes care of a lot of the kinds of arguments in favor of sense data. It takes care of the time lag one, as Mark pointed out, because I can certainly have photons be hitting my eyes from something that doesn't exist anymore. So it takes care of the common factor thing, because clearly a hallucination that's caused by some chemicals in my brain has a different metaphysical structure than photons hitting my eyes. It gets rid of the classic I'm seeing a table from a different angle thing. Sure, the table isn't changing. It's photons are hitting my eyes a different in a different pattern or something like that. So once we're scientific, once we're clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about what sight is, and we have analogs for, say, hearing and other things like that, it seems like most of the arguments for sense data go away. And if that's the case, if I'm not making some huge mistake, it would seem like if there's a metaphilosophical lesson here, it has to do with being scientifically informed when making these conjectures about what must be the case. But anyway, let me know if maybe the problem reproduces at the level of photons.
Okay, so I think that I mean, what you say is true. It's completely true that if you start from if you adopt that approach, then yeah, these problems basically dissolve. But but what I think that these people would say, Jackson and Robinson and all of them, that basically you're starting from an objective perspective, and they are starting from the subjective perspective. Their start of thinking about these issues is how things appear to you, and you are starting from the perspective of what is physically the case in such situations. And as Robinson said, that when he talked about the empiricists and all the philosophers in the Cartesian tradition, they believe that there could be no greater certainty than this most basic conscious impressions. So the idea is that our knowledge of the world starts with our experiences as they appear subjectively to us from the first person point of view. And they would probably object to what you are saying. They would probably object in a way that they would say that all the evidence that we have for anything about the world is gained through first-person perspective, through subjective experiences of the world, and it is in these situations the problem of veridical perceptions and hallucinations arises, and you cannot use. They would probably have to say that you cannot use this objective picture of the world to invalidate what is the basic starting point of knowledge of the world. If that makes sense, I'm not saying that I agree with that I would agree with this response, but I feel that this would be their response, that they would object to what you were saying as that if it somehow invalidates this subjective perspective, which has to be basic in all our thinking about our knowledge of the world or experience of the world. But yeah.
If I could, I mean, wouldn't isn't the question? I mean, someone who's giving the line I'm giving doesn't have to deny subjective experience. But the question is, what does subjective experience tell us about what kinds of things exist? And it was this kind of gap in explanation that these puzzles, like the angle of the table and the time lag argument and things like that, they give rise to this idea that, oh, there's got to be this other thing, sense data, because otherwise we can't explain these problems. But someone pushing my line can say, yeah, no, we have subjective experiences, but the subjective experiences are just reducible to, in the case of sight, the vision hitting my eyes and the rest of the mechanical processes going on, and so on. I mean, again, it's not my area, so I feel like I'm probably oversimplifying things in a lot of ways, but that's, I think.
Yeah, so you would deny both the phenomenal principle and the common factor principle, right?
I'm definitely denying the common factor principle.
Yeah,
it seems quite clear that hallucinations and perception are very different things. I'm not seeing something. If seeing is our folk term for photons hitting my eyes, I'm not seeing anything with hallucination. The phenomenal principle, am I having a subjective experience?
You can have visual experiences. Yeah.
So I'm not sure I'm
But
denying
what would you say about this case? So what would you say about this case? That you have a visual experience, but there are no photons hitting your eyes because you have it because a neuroscientist is directly stimulating your brain.
Yeah, that's not a visual experience. That's what I say. I mean, maybe that's a loose way of talking, but that's
Okay,
a vision. Okay. So look, there are two things happen. There are two kinds of things that can happen, right? They could seem quite similar. It just doesn't seem like that the hallucination is that the stimulation of the brain is
you're a disjunctivist. You're a naive realist, actually. That's the naive realist position, actually. It's very popular these days. It's very popular these days. Yeah.
I'm sure someone's going to point out what the problem is.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you. I think it was Mattia now, right? Yeah. Yeah. So the idea is that there is this basic layer of metaphysical structure that is identical in all situations, and that is that you are in all situations you are acquainted with the sense datum. But what differentiates veridical perceptions and illusions and hallucinations is the causal story that led to you being acquainted to a sense datum. So in veridical perceptions, your acquaintance with the sense datum is the effect of physical objects stimulating your eyes and nerves and brain. In illusions, it's also like that, but the sense datum that you're now acquainted with is a different one than the one you are usually acquainted with when you are affected by such an object. For example, it's an object which you usually see as red, but now you see it as orange. And in hallucinations, you are acquainted with the sense datum, but there is no external cause of that. It's simply the cause may be a drug you took, or maybe there's no physical cause at all. Maybe God can produce a sense datum in your mind. So in this sense, there is this layer of there's this part of metaphysical structure that is always the same, but the situations differ in this metaphysical structure, which is somehow external to the sense datum, you being acquainted with the sense datum. Basically, what caused this acquaintance with the sense datum? That is what is different. That is what's metaphysically different in these different situations. I don't know if that helps. Is that some kind of answer? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I don't know who is next.
David, Marian, David.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, hi. I'm Marian
Hi.
David.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Ljudevit.
I'm from the University of Graz
Yeah.
in
Great.
Austria. Two small points for improvement, maybe. There's also an additional argument, the doubling argument, where you press your eyeball and you see two flames of the candle, or you see two noses, right, and things like that. That might actually be different, an additional different argument, because it's different from the phenomenological principle, because you go from there's really only one object, but there seem to be two objects, and number is not a quality, not a property of objects, right? So it's really a different argument. You might want to look at that too, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And about the hallucination argument, the way you present it, I think there is a potential problem. The word immediate object of perception shows up in the conclusion.
Yeah.
And even though you have the immediate only in parentheses, it's really crucial to the conclusion.
Yeah.
But the word doesn't show up in any of the premises. So the word must be hidden in the commonality premise, right? That they all are similar. What do you call it? The premise,
the common factor principle.
The common factor premise, right? So the notion of immediacy must show up in the common factor premise, and then one would like to see what this premise actually would look like spelled out. It's a bit vague the way you have it, right?
Yeah.
And especially because the notion of immediacy has to enter at that point, right? Then it seems to me it would be good to spell it out more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
was
think
just a suggestion.
Yeah. No, that's a great suggestion. And I have a good response. The response is that I simply forgot to that I was careless in formulating the argument and forgot to put it in the premises. But there is Jackson has this whole debate. So this is not something that I went into because it's actually I would have to take another 20 minutes or half an hour to talk about that. But there's actually a pretty big it's a complicated issue to say what do sense data theorists think about whether we perceive physical objects in any sense at all. And so Jackson has this idea that we do perceive them, but mediately or indirectly. And the only direct objects of experience are sense data, but physical objects are indirect objects of experience. Now he has this whole debate and attempt to define immediate perception and mediate perception, or direct and indirect perception, and which I think is problematic, and and it's interesting to see that most of the other authors actually don't go into much detail about that, and that either explicitly, like Russell did, say that we don't perceive the physical objects, we simply infer their existence. To perceive is to perceive directly. There's no such thing as indirect perception. And physical objects do cause sense data, but our relationship with them is the relationship of inference and not of indirect perception. Or they simply say that we indirectly perceive physical objects, and then they refer you to Jackson's book. And Jackson, my main problem with his idea that we can indirectly perceive physical objects is that it doesn't seem to me that there is such a thing as indirect perception. Okay, I'll try to say this very briefly, not to lengthen this talk. The idea is that physical objects are metaphysically distinct from sense data. They cause sense data. Sense data are direct objects of our perception. And when Jackson says that there is nothing problematic about indirect perception, and he gives examples of indirect perception in everyday talk, and the examples he gives are, for example, The most common example is the table and its surface. And he says, okay, we directly see, just assume that direct realism is true. He said, we directly see the table's surface, but indirectly we see the entire table. Or I directly see one side of the house, but indirectly I see the entire house. And he says, so there's nothing problematic about this idea of indirect perception. And just as we can indirectly see physical objects because we directly perceive their surfaces, just like that, we directly perceive sense data and we indirectly perceive physical objects which cause the occurrence of sense data in us. I think that's very problematic because in all these examples that he mentioned of us seeing physical objects by seeing their surfaces, the thing that we directly perceive is a constitutive part of the whole object that we supposedly indirectly perceive. But sense data are not parts of physical objects. There's a causal relationship between them, but there's not a causal relationship between one side of the house and the entire house. The relationship is constitutive. And it seems to me that it is very problematic to extend this very clear idea of indirect perception in these everyday cases where basically he says we perceive the part and thus perceive the whole which it is a part of, to claim that we indirectly perceive something which causes something else that we directly perceive. But that's a whole, you see that's a whole another debate. I didn't want to go into that because it's very problematic, but I would say you are absolutely right. I forgot to, I was somewhat careless in the formulation of the argument, and that is basically the central issue. And one of my problems with sense data is that they cannot, this theory cannot explain how we perceive physical world in any sense. So that's what I would say about that.
One additional point I had maybe by way of criticism when you were talking about the existential implication of awareness.
Yeah.
I think of this different than you did. I would say no, they are not committed to existential implication of awareness in general. It's just in this specific case when it seems to me that there is I have a hallucination. It seems to me there's a dagger there. Then it follows that there is something there that has a shape or something, right? So I would have thought it doesn't have to do with fictional objects or anything, right? Of course, I can be aware of Sherlock Holmes by thinking of him. Then I don't have any existence thing, yeah? If I am aware of him by envisaging him, by making a mental picture of him, then it seems to me there is something I'm aware of. Of course, it's not Sherlock Holmes, it's just a picture of Sherlock Holmes, right? So I would have thought it's not the general issue of existential implication of awareness. The point of the phenomenological principle is that it's exactly this phenomenological awareness that should give the existence claim.
Yeah, it's limited to perception.
It's very narrow, just for this case, not in general.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
I think it's Boran now, right?
Thank you. Well, I have an article. It's unfortunately written in Croatian. It's on the active subject.
Yeah, I know.
Used in Croatia. Well, there, I'm arguing that content of your lecture, all this idea of sense data or mental representations, just roughly assume that's the same thing. That I call that anti-realistic fallacy. So what the anti-realistic fallacy consists in? So, well, you're seeing the wall. However, oh no, you're not seeing the wall. You're seeing your mental representation of the wall. Therefore, physical objects are not objects of perception. I call that anti-realistic fallacy. In my view, the origin of fallacy is the fact that we are confusing two levels. Personal level is that you, person, human body, well, man, a person sees the wall. That is personal level. However, there is subpersonal level, neurological, and so on. And in the subpersonal level pops up something like mental representation or sense data or so on. So sense data, according to my picture, would be part of the mechanism by which you see the wall. It would be wrong to conclude that you do not see the wall, that you see the sense data of the wall. So they're part of the mechanism. So I was defending direct realism there. So according to that picture, I think that my picture can embrace both principles, your phenomenal principle and common factor principle. Actually, it is phenomenal principle. It is principle that forces us to stipulate the existence of sense data or mental representations for cases of dreams or hallucinations and so on. And common factor principle is that in both cases, veridical and non-veridical, one part of the mechanism is the same. So my picture would include both of these principles here. And I don't know what to say about your last point that this is specifically philosophical explanation, not a scientific one. And then you have a couple of reasons there. One reason was that there are a priori principles and so on. I don't know what to say there roughly. Maybe I would argue maybe that in science as well, we have some general a priori principles and so on. So that our overall aim of our theory is to explain how the mechanism of perception works. So that is ultimately the scientific thing. Although it's very general, theory of space and time is even more general. Well, so there are still nevertheless scientific theories. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So let me comment. Let me start on this second point. I agree with you, and I think I mean in general, I don't. The difference between philosophical explanation and scientific explanation will always be a matter of degree, of course. That doesn't mean that it's unimportant or that it's somehow minor. It can be very, very important and very strong difference, but it will be a difference of degree, because, as you said, in science they use conceptual truths and necessary truths and definitions of terms, and in philosophy we use premises which are contingently true, which are empirically determined to be true. But I think that in most cases differences in the how big of a part do these conceptual premises play in which argument. So in science it's usually a less important part than this empirical part, while in philosophy it's usually the other way around. But there are also cases in which I think it is impossible to say, in which it is true to say that a certain debate or a problem is both philosophical and scientific. And I think that the what you mentioned at the end of your comment, the space and time theories of space and time are actually a great example of that. And I think that in when you go into well, I heard somewhere people who work in foundations of physics, they say that philosophers treat them as physicists and physicists treat them as philosophers, and they can determine where they belong because they belong to both. They belong to both disciplines. And similarly, in cognitive science, there are problems in cognitive science that belong equally to the empirical part of cognitive science and the philosophy of mind. And so in that regard, I don't really have a problem with. So let me say this. Maybe my idea is that this is a part. This debate is in this interdisciplinary area, with some parts actually maybe belonging more to the traditional philosophical type of explanation, and some other parts, literally these intentionalists who explain experience by reference to propositional content, maybe they're more partial to this modern cognitive approach, and maybe the sense data theorists favor this more metaphysical approach, but of course that it is a matter of degree. Let me go back to your first comment and say something about that. I have no problem with that. I agree with that, except there is one thing. If you say that when you see the wall, there's this subpersonal level in which there are various computations and representations in your neural system by which you see the wall, which are the means or the instrument of you seeing the wall. So one difference of that picture with what I presented here would be this. So say you have an experience of a wall that is white. Okay, so this experience has accuracy conditions. Either it is accurate or inaccurate. What determines the accuracy of your experience? The wall. Okay, how it in direct realist picture, what determines whether your experience is veridical or not is how the things stand with the wall. Is the wall really white? Is the wall really the way you see it? And in this way, in this sense, in direct realist picture, the representations, or what you call sense data, are not what determines the accuracy of your experience. They are not truth makers of your experience. The physical object is the truth maker of your experience. But according to sense data theorists, sense data are the truth makers so far. Sense data are the truth makers of our experiences in the primary sense because our experiences are always accurate in the primary sense.
That's anti-realistic fallacy.
Yeah. I agree with that. I agree with you. I would simply avoid calling these representations sense data. It's just that.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with your entire proposed mechanism. I agree with it.
There's one more important difference. These authors, Jackson and others, or Descartes, they kind of suggest that we are directly aware of sense data or mental representations.
Yeah.
To my picture, we are not directly aware of that. We are directly aware of objects. And these mental representations are theoretical constructs. My favorite author on this is Hans Reichenbach in Experience and Prediction. He calls that reduplication theory. That whenever you have a wall, you stipulate the mental representation of the wall. So that will be substantial difference between me and Jackson and others.
Yeah. So just let me comment briefly on that last thing. So while they do claim that we are directly aware of sense data, they usually, apart from Moore, who had all these weird ideas, they agree that it does not appear to us that we are acquainted with sense data, that it appears to us that we are simply aware of physical objects. But the idea is that sense data are direct objects of our experience, but we know that not by introspection, but we know that by theory. So we need theoretical reflection to realize what it is actually that we are directly aware of. Introspectively, it seems to us, it seems as if direct realism is true, but theoretical arguments show that it's not true. Russell thought that, Jackson is explicit about that, Robinson is explicit about that. Only Moore, I mean, not only Moore, but Moore was the most famous one who claimed that he is introspectively aware of sense data, but he also said that he is introspectively aware of propositions as if they were physical objects. So I don't know. Moore had all these ideas. Yeah.
Watch out! Moore also said that they're transparent.
Yeah.
Earlier, he said they're transparent, so we're sort of looking through them, not noticing that they're there. As it were. So he changed his mind about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So, well, if there are no more comments or questions, we can finish. Ljudevit, do you
Yes.
have anything else to no? Well, that would be it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ljudevit.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.